law got in common? Well, the answer is super thin condoms. Australian researchers have recently discovered that the native spinifex grass contains thin but incredibly strong natural fibres. Aboriginal communities have traditional knowledge about the use of spinifex resins, which have adhesive properties that have been used for thousands of years in building materials and hunting tools. Meanwhile, the recent scientific research has shown that the nanofibres contained in spinifex grass have practical implications in things like plastics and super thin condoms. However, this research has been affected by the fragmentation of Australian biodiscovery law. Biodiscovery is the process whereby biological resources are collected, then genetic or biochemical components are isolated, and the useful derivative products are potentially commercialised. The products of biodiscovery research are often subject to intellectual property law, including patents. And as I already alluded to, traditional knowledge is often used as a starting point for the identification of biological materials of potential interest. So, in the spinifex case study, there was Aboriginal knowledge about the use of spinifex resins for building materials, which led to the research and ultimate discovery of the nanofibres, which have practical implications for the development of condoms, and for which the researchers have applied for patents. Now, while the spinifex researchers have worked directly with the relevant Indigenous community and had their permission to apply for the patents, many organisations have faced allegations of so-called biopiracy, whereby they collected resources and used traditional knowledge and commercialised products without sharing a portion of the benefits or seeking the consent of the relevant communities. For that reason, many Indigenous communities and national governments have advocated for a legal framework that would allow them to control access to biological resources on their lands, and that would also ensure that any commercial benefits arising from the use of those resources would be shared equitably with the relevant communities. Now, against that backdrop, the parties to the United Nations, when they drafted the Convention on Biological Diversity, included the following two provisions. To summarise, Article 8J requires that if traditional knowledge is used, then the relevant bioprospecting entity must seek the permission and share equitably the benefits arising from commercialisation with the local and Indigenous community. Meanwhile, Article 15 is more focused on sharing the benefits with the relevant state government. However, these two articles did not create much of a legal framework, and so in 2002, the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity developed the non-binding voluntary guidelines called the Bond Guidelines on Access and Benefit Sharing. These were supplemented 10 years later by the Nagoya Protocol, a binding treaty about access and benefit sharing law. Now, in Australia, while the country is party to the Convention on Biological Diversity and has signed the Nagoya Protocol, Australia has not yet ratified the treaty. Now, under Section 51 of the Constitution, the allocation of powers means that states and territories retain the power to make environmental laws in their jurisdiction. However, pursuant to the ruling in the Tasmanian Dams case, the Commonwealth Government does have the power to enact legislation to enact its international obligations, including those under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And thus we have the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act of 1999. Now, recognising that the power to make access and benefit sharing laws is fragmented across the Commonwealth states and territories, the governments came together in 2002 to draft a unified policy document, which they called the Nationally Consistent Approach on Access and Benefit Sharing. Pursuant to that approach, the Commonwealth Government introduced amendments to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which inserted access and benefit sharing provisions to the legislation. Furthermore, Queensland introduced legislation in 2004, followed by legislation in the Northern Territory in 2006. But this is where access and benefit sharing laws in Australia have run into serious problems. To this day, the other states and territories have not enacted any access and benefit sharing laws pursuant to the nationally consistent approach. Furthermore, for the legislation that does exist, the provisions themselves, in terms of their substance and enforcement, has been very inconsistent or fragmented. And so, the purpose of my research was to understand the precise nature and the practical implications of that fragmentation. My My methodology involved doctrinal analysis of the international agreements and Australian legislation, as well as socio-legal analysis of journal articles, reports, and my interviews conducted with the Queensland and Northern Territory government officials. It should be noted that my paper was limited to a comparison of the Queensland and Northern Territory laws. To analyse these laws, I used a simplified version of the regulatory pyramid of criminal justice enforcement, which was developed by John Braithwaite at the Australian National University. The pyramid depicts an overall law enforcement strategy comprising an escalation of measures that corresponds to the assumed disposition of the actor. At the bottom of the pyramid, we have persuasive measures like guidelines and protocols. Moving up the pyramid, the legal threats become more severe and include measures like fines, negative publicity, and ultimately incarceration. So as I mentioned, all the Australian jurisdictions came together in 2002 to develop the national and consistent approach. However, as I already mentioned, only the Queensland, Northern Territory and Commonwealth governments have actually implemented legislation. So the coverage of access and benefit sharing laws in Australia looks more like this. In the Northern Territory, the law applies to the whole jurisdiction. That is to say, it applies to Crown land, as well as private land and Indigenous land. However, the Commonwealth and Queensland laws only apply to Crown land, such as national parks. And so in reality, the coverage of the laws looks more like this. Now what this means in practice is that an entity that seeks to conduct so-called biopiracy can engage in what is called forum shopping. That is to say, collecting biological resources from an area of land where no access and benefit sharing laws apply. That means that so-called biopirates, at the top of the pyramid here, are not subject to any deterrence measures in most Australian jurisdictions, or even within some jurisdictions, certain areas of land. But this incompleteness is not the only problem faced by access and benefit sharing laws in Australia. My research indicated that most of the biodiscovery research in Australia is being conducted by researchers at universities. Even before the legislation came into force, these university researchers were subject to ethical rules about access and benefit sharing. And even after the legislation was brought in, researchers who were doing their work in jurisdictions without any laws in place were still voluntarily entering into benefit sharing agreements and obtaining access permits, even where they had no legal obligation to do so. But with the implementation of the Queensland and Northern Territory laws, these so-called virtuous actors became subject to inconsistent or bureaucratic frameworks, which they had to navigate in order to conduct their research. This increase in red tape effectively punished these virtuous actors for complying with the principles of access and benefit sharing. So let's have a look at that fragmentation in a bit more detail. Starting in Queensland, the Biodiscovery Act created a whole new permit system. This means that an entity that seeks to conduct biodiscovery work, if they wish to do so legally, must obtain a suite of 3 instruments. The first is obtained from the Department of the Environment, that is, a collection authority, which is effectively a permit to go and physically take the biological resources from Crown land. They must also negotiate with the Department of Science in order to obtain an approved biodiscovery plan and enter into a benefit sharing contract with the Queensland government. Then they are allowed to collect biological materials for those purposes. Now in my discussions with the Department of the Environment, it was indicated that only 5 collection authorities have been issued since the legislation came into force in 2004. And it should be emphasised that given the level of research going on in Queensland, that is a very low number. Furthermore, it was only for the first time this year that the Department of the Environment exercises powers under Section 45 of the Act to issue what is called a Biodiscovery Collection Protocol. And that was for the spinifex research that I mentioned earlier, which is taking place on the Northern Territory border. I'll return to that shortly. So looking now to the regime in the Northern Territory, this framework is slightly more complicated. Firstly, it should be noted that the legislation in the Northern Territory uses slightly different terminology. That is to say, they use the term bioprospecting to describe the same activities as biodiscovery. Now, rather than creating a whole new permit system like in Queensland, the Northern Territory law used the existing permit issuing authorities to regulate the access to biological resources in the land. So, for example, if an entity applies to the Parks and Wildlife Commission, then when the application for a permit determined that bioprospecting may be involved, the application is passed on to the Department of Primary Industry and Resources. Then, if it is determined that bioprospecting is involved in that research, the law requires that a benefit sharing contract be made. Now, if the biological materials are being collected from state land, then the parties to that contract are the Northern Territory Government and the bioprospecting entity. However, if the materials are being collected from state or Indigenous land, then the parties are the bioprospecting entity and either the private landowner or a representative of the Aboriginal community. Furthermore, if a third party may be using the materials for bioprospecting downstream, then they must also enter into a benefit sharing contract with either the Northern Territory Government or the relevant private landowner. Once evidence of those benefit sharing contracts has been received, then the matter is referred back to the permit issuing authority, such as the Parks and Wildlife Commission, and then they may issue their permit for the collection of biological resources. Once again, when I spoke with the officials in the Northern Territory, they indicated that about 5 to 10 benefit sharing agreements have been made in the last decade pursuant to this legislation. And again, this appears to be a very low number, although it should be noted that the data from the Northern Territory is less clear because it has moved departments several times and there are a few gaps. So in terms of a way forward, the government officials in both the Northern Territory and Queensland have recognised that legislation is currently not meeting its objectives. That is to say that given the incompleteness and fragmentation of the laws, it's been very difficult to enforce them. However, Queensland and the Northern Territory have been very reluctant to undertake any significant reforms to their laws to increase the completeness until there is corresponding legislation in other jurisdictions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Queensland Government only exercises powers under Section 45 of the legislation recently to issue the collection protocol for the spin effects research. But it should be noted that this exercise of powers was not the result of any increased enforcement policy from the Queensland Government, but rather it was the result of proactive requests from the researchers undertaking the spin effects work. And there are no plans, as far as the government is concerned, to increase the enforcement of the legislation anytime soon. One other change that is being brought in, however, is firstly to increase the level of communication with virtuous actors by focusing on persuasive measures. That is to say, by developing more guidelines to help facilitate university researchers to navigate the legal framework. Furthermore, the Queensland Government is hoping to reduce the level of bureaucracy involved in this legislation. Currently, a subsequent entity that wishes to conduct biodiscovery research must enter into a whole new benefit sharing contract with the Queensland Government. But proposed amendments before the Legislative Assembly would allow for so-called subsequent use agreements, whereby entities can enter into licensing arrangements without the involvement of the government, and thereby reducing red tape. So, to conclude, a house divided against itself cannot stand. If access and benefit sharing laws in Australia are to meet their policy objectives, then there needs to be a harmonised approach to these laws rather than a fragmented one. Otherwise, the current situation will continue, whereby biopirates can evade the legislation by engaging in forum shopping, while the increased red tape of these fragmented regimes would only punish the virtuous actors who would be conducting their research ethically anyway.
Thank you. I just have some questions. Do you have any ideas through your research why there's been lack of cooperation amongst the rest of the states and territories in coming on board and having the legislation?
Well, my research did reveal that there are draft bills that were put together by many other governments. Tasmania and particularly WA had drafted legislation back around 2004 and had intended at the time to introduce bills that were similar to those in Queensland or the Northern Territory. The issue has ultimately come down to being a political one, where changes of governments around those times meant that the priorities in the states have changed, and therefore the political willpower to enact that legislation, or indeed the pressure from industry, has been reduced. And that has meant that it never made it past the legislative assemblies or other relevant governments.
Can you explain the relationship between the Commonwealth legislation
focused on the Crown lands, so national parks, what goes on in Commonwealth marine parks, whereas the legislation in the Northern Territory and Queensland is very much focused on the lands that are within the ambit of their jurisdiction. There's not much coherence at all. So there would have to be a lot more intergovernmental dialogue for there to be any plugging of holes, like you suggest.
On the map you display, this is just for clarification on my part, with Queensland, yes, so it's so many red patches there, whereas the Northern Territory it's all blue. Why is that? Why are there sort of corresponding patches in the Northern Territory? I was just unsure about that.
So because the law in the Northern Territory provides the parallel regimes for the Crown lands and then for private land, it means that the whole jurisdiction is covered by that. Obviously a lot of the Northern Territory is in fact Indigenous owned land, and the fact that that is also covered means that although they're subject to slightly different rules depending on whether they are private land, the whole jurisdiction is covered. Whereas if you're a researcher in Queensland and you find a useful plant that's on one of these red patches, but the plant also, given that it doesn't respect boundaries, grows elsewhere, then you can select to collect the plant from one of the areas that's not covered and the legislation would not apply there. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I guess some of the research you've done may be confidential, but in terms of biopiracy or foreign shopping, did you come across sort of a lot of examples of private companies that are engaging in that activity?
It's a bit of a difficult one to find evidence of, mainly because if you were to find evidence of biopiracy, you'd be finding evidence of something illegal, and so obviously companies aren't very willing to disclose they are engaging in that. But what I did find was a lot of evidence of organisations like the University of South Australia, for example, who are conversely conducting research in a way that goes beyond what the legislation requires. So obviously there's no legislation in South Australia, but they have agreements with many Indigenous communities to use their traditional knowledge and their biological resources, even though there's no actual legislative regime there. A lot of the examples of biopiracy are very old ones, unfortunately, like the smoke bush one that I mentioned in the paper.
So the South Australian model is almost like an informal handshake agreement.
Yeah, so because a lot of funding in scientific research is subject to ethical rules that bind the researchers, even if it doesn't bind them legally, it means they are subject to those other pressures in terms of guidelines that they follow for their research, which incentivize them to then enter into those benefit sharing contracts. And ultimately, it also looks good for the universities to say that they have these contracts with Indigenous communities whereby they're providing benefits and engaging with Aboriginal communities to have that flow of information and biological materials and still contribute to science.
What would you say are one of the motivators of biopiracy? Is it more a case of money or just wanting to avoid the red tape?
Well, originally biopiracy was very popular because it was a great way to identify very quickly, rather than using a random approach of generating lots of chemicals and testing them individually, going after biological materials where there was already traditional knowledge indicating a certain therapeutic outcome. So it really sped up the process that way. Certainly, the red tape of access and benefit sharing laws around the world does create a little bit of bureaucracy, which adds to the cost of a research organisation. But there's very little motivation to conduct biopiracy these days on the international plane because, I mentioned the Nagoya Protocol, and because the Nagoya Protocol has been implemented by many other larger jurisdictions where the market for, say, pharmaceuticals is a lot bigger, the fact that entities conducting research in Australia who would want to commercialise their products overseas will still have to show compliance with access to benefit sharing laws means that motivation has been reduced, even if they could get away with it domestically.
Do you think the Commonwealth needs to take greater leadership in trying to overcome the inactivity of the states and territories, or is it a case of just trying to encourage them at the state and territory level?
Well, I think they certainly need to be more proactive about organising meetings, because ultimately getting any kind of harmonisation of the laws across the Australian jurisdictions will require representatives from the governments to sit down together and discuss what policy objectives they're trying to achieve. And meetings take time and money, and so there would be a need for the Commonwealth government to take leadership there. Unfortunately, when I was talking to the members of the Queensland government, they did many Queensland organisations and Northern Territory organisations are getting frustrated with the fact that they're subject to more red tape. The Queensland Government is planning to try and organise some kind of intergovernmental meeting to try and get some more harmonisation happening and hopefully provide enough political pressure on the other jurisdictions to have a more coherent regime.
Almost finished, but in your research, did you have an opportunity to meet with any of the Aboriginal communities that were affected by this?
I did have some interactions with the community for the Tulangan Aboriginal Corporation in northern Queensland. That was by email, but I didn't get the opportunity to speak directly with any communities, mainly because establishing those relationships would have taken more time than I had, and I didn't want to try and rush any of that.
Just one more question. This is more of a general question. What motivated you to explore this interesting topic?